In the spring of 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, one man clutched a briefcase containing 28 vials of liquid that had shaped the course of history. This wasn't a general, not a politician, not even a strategist. This was Dr. Theodor Morell, Hitler's personal physician, and in those final chaotic hours, he made a decision that would puzzle historians for decades. The story you're about to hear isn't just about a doctor who treated one of history's most notorious figures. It's about how a man with questionable credentials injected his way into the inner circle of power, possibly altered the decisions of an entire regime, and then vanished into a historical fog that has never fully cleared. What happened to Hitler's private doctor? The answer is far stranger than you might imagine. To understand how Theodor Morell ended up as Hitler's most trusted medical advisor, we need to go back to a time when he was just another struggling physician trying to make a name for himself. Born in 1886 in the small German town of Treis-Münzenberg, Theodor Morell was the son of a schoolteacher. Nothing in his early life suggested he would one day control access to the most powerful man in Europe. He studied medicine in Grenoble and Paris, served as a military doctor during the First World War, and afterward opened a private practice in Berlin. But Morell wasn't content with ordinary patients. He specialized in what we might call fashionable medicine, treating venereal diseases among the city's elite with discretion and expensive remedies of dubious effectiveness. He developed his own patent medicines, marketed them aggressively, and cultivated a reputation among Berlin's upper classes. By the 1930s, Morell had become the kind of doctor wealthy people whispered about at parties. Not because he was particularly skilled, but because he promised results that conventional medicine couldn't deliver. He was charming, accommodating, and most importantly, he never asked uncomfortable questions. The turning point came in 1936 through a connection that seemed almost absurdly mundane. Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer and close friend, had been treated successfully by Morell for a gonorrhea infection. Hoffmann was so impressed, or perhaps so grateful for Morell's discretion, that he introduced the doctor to Hitler at a social gathering. At the time, Hitler was suffering from chronic stomach pain, eczema on his legs, and digestive issues that conventional doctors had failed to resolve. Within months of their first meeting, Morell had examined the Führer and prescribed a treatment regimen that he claimed would revolutionize Hitler's health. What happened next shocked everyone in Hitler's inner circle. The treatments seemed to work. Hitler's energy returned. His stomach problems diminished. He became, by all accounts, a new man. And just like that, a relatively unknown physician with a practice catering to Berlin socialites became the most powerful doctor in Nazi Germany. But here's where the story gets interesting. While Hitler sang Morell's praises, calling him irreplaceable and defending him against all critics, almost everyone else around the Führer despised the man. They called him crude, unhygienic, and incompetent. Hermann Göring nicknamed him the Reich injection master with obvious disdain. Albert Speer later wrote that Morell's presence in Hitler's headquarters was like having a quack at the helm of the nation's health. So what was really going on? How did a man universally disliked by the Nazi elite maintain absolute control over Hitler's medical care for nearly 9 years? To answer that question, we need to examine what Theodor Morell was actually doing to Hitler. And this is where the story transforms from unusual to genuinely disturbing. Morell's treatment philosophy was simple. More is better. He prescribed an astonishing array of medications, injections, and his own proprietary compounds. We know this because Morell was meticulous about record-keeping. He documented nearly every injection, every pill, every treatment in detailed medical notes that would later be captured by Allied forces. On an average day during the war years, Hitler received between 8 and 10 different medications. But these weren't your standard aspirin and vitamins. The list reads like something from a pharmaceutical fever dream. There was Vitamultin, one of Morell's own creations, a vitamin compound that Hitler took multiple tablets of daily. Ultraseptal, a sulfonamide antibiotic that Hitler took constantly, often without any active infection. Methamphetamine, marketed under the brand name Pervitin, which Morell administered regularly to boost Hitler's energy and mood. Eucodal, a synthetic opioid twice as powerful as morphine. Testosterone, atropine, belladonna, strychnine in small doses, supposedly for digestion. And then there were the injections. Morell gave Hitler injections nearly every single day. Some were vitamins, others were glucose, but many contained compounds that historians and medical experts are still debating today. One particularly controversial treatment involved Mutaflor, a preparation containing bacteria from human feces, which Morell claimed would restore Hitler's gut health. Yes, you heard that correctly. Hitler's personal physician was giving him capsules derived from intestinal bacteria as a probiotic treatment decades before such therapies became mainstream. But perhaps the most significant element in Morell's arsenal was something called Vitamultin Forte. According to captured medical records, this compound contained not just vitamins, but also small amounts of strychnine and atropine. Morell administered this multiple times per day. Now, here's where medical historians begin to disagree. Some argue that Morell was simply practicing the flawed medicine of his era when the long-term effects of many substances weren't understood. Others suggest something far more troubling, that Morell's treatments may have fundamentally altered Hitler's mental state, judgment, and physical health in ways that affected his decision-making. Consider the timeline. In the early years of Morell's treatment, from 1937 to 1941, Hitler appeared energetic, made calculated strategic decisions, and maintained a relatively coherent foreign policy, however morally abhorrent. But as the war progressed and Morell's treatments intensified, particularly the introduction of regular opioid and methamphetamine injections, Hitler's behavior changed dramatically. By 1943, those around Hitler noted increasing paranoia, rage episodes, tremors in his left hand, and erratic strategic decisions. He would stay awake for days, then crash into depression. His military conferences became increasingly unhinged. He made catastrophic tactical errors that defied military logic. Were these changes simply the stress of a losing war? The psychological breakdown of a tyrant facing defeat? Or were they, at least in part, the neurological effects of years of daily injections containing stimulants, opioids, and other powerful compounds? Dr. Ernst Günther Schenk, a Wehrmacht doctor who observed Hitler in the final weeks, later testified that the Führer showed clear signs of Parkinson's disease combined with drug dependency. He described Hitler's shuffling walk, his trembling hands, and his dilated pupils as consistent with chronic amphetamine use. But Morell always insisted his treatments were revolutionary and necessary. He kept Hitler dependent on daily injections, convincing the Führer that without them he couldn't function. And Hitler believed him completely. When other doctors suggested alternative treatments or raised concerns, Hitler dismissed them and defended Morell with almost religious fervor. This raises a disturbing question. In protecting his personal physician, was Hitler unknowingly protecting the very thing that was destroying his health and possibly his judgment? What makes the Morell story particularly fascinating is that we don't have to speculate entirely. Multiple people in Hitler's inner circle left detailed accounts of the doctor's presence and practices, and their testimonies paint a picture far more complex than simple medical malpractice. Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect and later Minister of Armaments, wrote extensively about Morell in his memoirs. He described a man who was physically repulsive, often arriving at meetings with food stains on his uniform, poor hygiene, and bad breath. But Speer also noted something crucial. Hitler's absolute, unwavering faith in Morell bordered on the irrational. Speer recalled an incident in 1944 when several of Hitler's other physicians tried to convince the Führer to submit to a comprehensive medical examination by neutral specialists. Hitler refused outright, stating that Morell was the only doctor he trusted and that all the others were simply jealous of Morell's success. Dr. Karl Brandt, one of Hitler's other physicians and a highly respected surgeon, became so concerned about Morell's treatments that he secretly arranged for one of Morell's vitamin compounds to be analyzed by a chemist. The results allegedly showed the presence of strychnine, though in what quantity remains debated. When Brandt confronted Hitler with this information, Hitler flew into a rage and eventually had Brandt removed from his medical staff. Heinrich Hoffmann, the photographer who had introduced Morell to Hitler, later expressed regret about the introduction. In post-war interviews, Hoffmann suggested that Morell's treatments had changed Hitler for the worse, making him more erratic and dependent. But perhaps the most revealing testimony comes from Morell himself. After the war, when interrogated by American intelligence officers, Morell provided his own account of treating Hitler. He insisted that every treatment was medically sound, that Hitler's improvements under his care proved the effectiveness of his methods, and that other doctors were simply envious of his close relationship with the Führer. Yet there's a strange detail in these interrogation transcripts that historians have noted. When pressed about the specific contents of some of his proprietary compounds, Morell became evasive. He claimed certain formulas were trade secrets. He said some records had been destroyed in the bombing of Berlin. He couldn't or wouldn't provide complete disclosure of everything he had administered to Hitler over 9 years. This has led some researchers to suggest that Morell himself might not have fully understood the pharmacological interactions of the multiple compounds he was giving Hitler. He was, after all, not a trained pharmacologist or toxicologist. He was a generalist physician who had developed his own patent medicines based on empirical observation rather than rigorous scientific testing. Traudl Junge, one of Hitler's personal secretaries, provided perhaps the most chilling observation. She described watching Morell prepare injections in Hitler's private quarters, noting that the doctor seemed to perform this ritual with an almost priestly solemnity. Hitler would sit calmly, roll up his sleeve, and wait for what he called his energy boost. Junge said Hitler referred to these moments as when he became himself again. Think about that phrasing for a moment. Hitler felt he could only be himself when under the influence of Morell's injections. Whatever those compounds contained, they had become so integral to Hitler's self-image and daily functioning that he couldn't imagine existing without them. As Soviet artillery began shelling Berlin in April 1945, the Nazi leadership fractured into chaos. Some fled. Others prepared for a final stand. And in the Führer bunker, beneath the Reich Chancellery Gardens, Theodor Morell faced a decision that would define the rest of his life. By this point, Hitler's health had deteriorated catastrophically. Multiple witnesses described a man barely recognizable from the vigorous leader of earlier years. He shuffled when he walked. His left hand shook uncontrollably. His face had taken on a grayish pallor. He would alternate between manic energy and complete exhaustion. Morell continued his daily injections, though supplies were becoming scarce. The briefcase he carried everywhere contained the remnants of his pharmaceutical arsenal, and he guarded it obsessively. But something changed in those final weeks. According to testimonies from bunker survivors, Morell became increasingly agitated. He argued with Hitler more frequently. Some witnesses reported hearing Morell suggest that Hitler needed to leave Berlin for medical treatment elsewhere, something Hitler refused to consider. On April 21st, just 9 days before Hitler's death, Morell experienced what he later described as a heart attack or severe episode of angina. Hitler's other attending physician, Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, examined Morell and recommended he leave the bunker immediately for proper treatment. And here's where the story takes its most mysterious turn. Hitler, the man who had defended Morell against all critics for nearly 9 years, who had claimed Morell was irreplaceable and essential to his survival, let him go without significant protest. Morell packed his briefcase, said farewell to Hitler in what witnesses described as an awkwardly formal exchange, and was driven out of Berlin to the town of Bad Reichenhall near the Austrian border. He arrived there on April 23rd. Why did Hitler, in his final days, allow his most trusted physician to leave? Some historians argue it was simply practical, that Morell was genuinely ill and no longer useful. Others suggest something more calculated, that Hitler knew the end was coming and wanted to ensure Morell survived to document his medical treatment, perhaps as some form of medical legacy. But there's a third possibility that's rarely discussed. What if Hitler had finally recognized in those last moments of clarity that Morell's treatments had been harmful? What if the dismissal was not mercy, but a final acknowledgement of betrayal, even if unintentional? We know from the diary of Johannes Henschel, the bunker's mechanic who remained until Soviet capture, that in the days after Morell's departure, Hitler appeared to suffer withdrawal symptoms. He became more irritable, complained of severe stomach pain, and at one point asked if anyone knew what had been in Morell's injections. Dr. Stumpfeger, who took over Hitler's medical care in those final days, administered significantly fewer medications. According to the few surviving accounts, he gave Hitler mostly sedatives and basic pain relief, a stark contrast to Morell's pharmaceutical barrage. When Soviet forces finally overran Berlin and entered the bunker, they found extensive medical records, empty medication bottles, and used syringes. But they didn't find Morell. He had already become a ghost in the collapsing Reich. After leaving Berlin, Theodor Morell should have been one of the most wanted men in post-war Europe. He possessed intimate knowledge of Hitler's final years, had been present at countless high-level meetings, and potentially held secrets about the regime's inner workings. Yet his capture didn't happen the way you might expect. Morell made his way to Bad Reichenhall, where he checked into a hospital under his own name. Not an alias, not an attempt to hide. He simply presented himself as Dr. Theodor Morell, suffering from a heart condition, and the staff admitted him. For 2 weeks, he remained there as Germany collapsed around him. American forces were sweeping through Bavaria, capturing Nazi officials by the hundreds. The OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, had extensive wanted lists with detailed descriptions and last known locations of key Nazi figures. And yet, no one came for Morell. It wasn't until May 19th, nearly 3 weeks after Germany's surrender, that American intelligence officers casually arrested him at the hospital. The circumstances are bizarrely anticlimactic. According to the military police report, Morell was sitting in a hospital bathrobe, reading a newspaper, when 2 officers walked in and asked if he was Hitler's doctor. He confirmed his identity, packed a small bag, and went with them without resistance. This raises an obvious question. Why wasn't Morell a higher priority? The Americans were desperately seeking information about Hitler's death, his final decisions, and the location of missing Nazi officials. Morell could have provided invaluable intelligence. The answer appears to be a bureaucratic oversight combined with a fundamental misunderstanding of Morell's significance. Intelligence officers were primarily hunting for military leaders, SS officers, and political officials. Doctors, even Hitler's personal physician, were considered lower priority. Additionally, early reports from captured Nazis had portrayed Morell as little more than a quack, a charlatan who had somehow fooled Hitler. The general assumption was that he knew nothing of real importance. This assessment would prove profoundly wrong. Once American intelligence realized who they actually had in custody, Morell became the subject of intensive interrogation. And what emerged from those sessions has fueled historical debate ever since. The interrogations took place at multiple locations over several months, primarily at a facility near Freising, Germany. Multiple intelligence officers, military doctors, and psychological experts questioned Morell, and their reports fill hundreds of pages in declassified archives. Morell was cooperative, almost eagerly so. He provided detailed accounts of his treatments, described Hitler's various ailments, and discussed his relationship with other Nazi officials. But there are strange inconsistencies throughout his testimony that have puzzled researchers. For instance, when asked about specific medications and their dosages, Morell's answers varied between interrogation sessions. He would claim one concentration of a drug in one interview, then cite a different amount in another. Sometimes he attributed symptoms to Hitler that matched the side effects of certain medications. Other times, he denied those medications could cause such effects. One particularly revealing exchange, documented in an August 1945 interrogation report, went like this. The interrogator asked Morell directly, "Did you know that the combination of medications you were giving Hitler could impair his judgment?" Morell's response, according to the transcript, was that all his treatments were based on observation and results, that Hitler had always responded positively, and that any negative effects were from stress and the burden of leadership, not medical treatment. The interrogator pressed further. But you gave him methamphetamine regularly. You gave him opioids. You combined stimulants with sedatives. Did you consider the long-term neurological effects? Morell's answer is striking. I gave the Führer what he needed to function. Without my treatments, he could not have led Germany through the war. Notice the phrasing. Not that the treatments improved Hitler's health, but that they allowed him to function at all. This suggests Morell understood, at least on some level, that Hitler had become dependent on his medications to maintain any semblance of normal operation. But here's what makes the interrogations truly fascinating. Morell never expressed remorse. He never suggested his treatments might have been harmful. Instead, he consistently portrayed himself as a dedicated physician who had done his best under difficult circumstances. American military doctors who examined Morell after his capture found him to be in poor health himself. He suffered from genuine heart problems, obesity, and showed signs of his own medication dependency. One examining physician wrote in his report that Morell appeared to be a man who believed his own mythology. The interrogations also revealed something unexpected. Morell had kept detailed diaries and medical records, not all of which were found in the bunker. When asked about these documents, Morell became evasive. He claimed some had been destroyed, others lost in his hasty departure from Berlin. But he hinted that certain records still existed somewhere, possibly hidden or given to someone for safekeeping. To this day, some of Morell's personal records remain missing. Historians have speculated they might contain information deemed too sensitive even for post-war disclosure, or perhaps they simply were lost in the chaos of Germany's collapse. By late 1945, American intelligence had concluded their interrogations. They determined that while Morell possessed valuable historical information about Hitler's medical condition and daily life, he presented no threat to Allied security and held no information about ongoing Nazi resistance or hidden assets. The decision was made to release him from custody. Before we discuss what actually happened to Morell after his release, we need to examine the theories that have emerged over the decades about his true role and fate, because they reveal something important about how history struggles with ambiguous figures. Some historians and researchers have suggested that Morell was intentionally harming Hitler, perhaps as part of a long-game assassination plot. This theory points to the toxic compounds in some of his medications and the progressive deterioration of Hitler's health and judgment. Proponents argue that Morell's working-class background and relative obscurity made him an unlikely true Nazi believer. Perhaps, they suggest, he saw an opportunity to sabotage the regime from within by slowly poisoning its leader. The evidence? The strychnine in some compounds, the excessive dosages, the bizarre combinations of medications that no responsible physician would prescribe, and Morell's own survival and cooperation with the Allies, which could indicate he was already working against the regime. However, most serious historians reject this theory. There's no evidence Morell had any political motivations beyond opportunism. His interrogations revealed a man obsessed with defending his medical reputation, not someone harboring secret resistance sympathies. And the timing doesn't work. If Morell wanted Hitler dead, he had countless opportunities to administer lethal doses undetected. The more widely accepted interpretation is that Morell was simply a mediocre physician who stumbled into a position of power and protected it through a combination of placebo effects, luck, and Hitler's psychological dependency. This theory suggests that Morell's early successes with Hitler were legitimate, that his treatments for Hitler's stomach problems and skin conditions happened to work despite being based on questionable science. Once established as Hitler's miracle doctor, Morell couldn't admit failure when problems arose. So he prescribed more, experimented more, and created a cycle of dependency that benefited his own prestige and wealth. The medical historian Hans-Joachim Neumann conducted extensive analysis of Morell's treatment records and concluded that most of the damage was unintentional. Morell believed he was helping Hitler. He genuinely thought his vitamin compounds and injections were revolutionary. He was, in Neumann's assessment, a product of his time's flawed medical practices, amplified by unchecked authority and a lack of medical oversight. A third interpretation, less discussed but supported by some evidence, is that Morell eventually realized his treatments were harming Hitler, but continued them anyway because he couldn't risk losing his position. Consider that by 1943, Morell had become extremely wealthy through his pharmaceutical companies, which received preferential contracts from the Nazi government. He lived in a mansion, had access to rationed resources unavailable to ordinary Germans, and wielded influence far beyond his actual qualifications. If he admitted his treatments were problematic, he would lose everything. So perhaps he made a calculated decision to continue, convincing himself that Hitler's problems were from stress rather than medication, and that stopping the treatments would be worse than continuing them. This theory is supported by Morell's increasingly defensive behavior in Hitler's inner circle, and his reluctance to allow other doctors to examine Hitler comprehensively. He was protecting his position, and if that meant keeping Hitler on a regimen of questionable medications, that was the price of his survival. Finally, there's a fringe theory that emerged in the 1970s, suggesting that Morell didn't simply fade into obscurity after the war, but was instead recruited by American or Soviet intelligence for his knowledge of pharmacological manipulation. This theory has no credible evidence supporting it. It appears to have originated from sensationalist books, mixing Morell's story with conspiracy theories about Nazi scientists being recruited for Cold War programs. While it's true that Operation Paperclip brought Nazi scientists to America, there's no documentation placing Morell in any such program, and his skill set wouldn't have been particularly valuable for military applications. So what really happened to Theodor Morell? The truth is simultaneously more mundane and more tragic than any of these theories. After his release from American custody in late 1945, Theodor Morell was a broken man. His wealth was gone, confiscated by Allied authorities as Nazi-affiliated assets. His pharmaceutical companies had been shut down. His mansion in Berlin was destroyed by bombing, and his reputation, which he had cultivated so carefully, was in ruins. He returned to the hospital in Bad Reichenhall, not as a prisoner, but as a patient. His heart condition was genuine and worsening. He had nowhere else to go. For a few months, Morell tried to rebuild some version of his medical practice. He applied for permission to work as a doctor in the American occupation zone, claiming his technical expertise and knowledge could benefit the German people recovering from war. The application was denied. The medical board cited his association with the Nazi regime, questions about his professional competence, and concerns about his character. They didn't explicitly mention his role as Hitler's physician, but it hung over the decision like a shadow. So Morell lived on limited funds, whatever he had managed to hide or save before the war's end. He moved into a modest apartment in Tegernsee, a small town in the Bavarian Alps. He lived alone. His wife had left him, though the exact circumstances and timing of their separation remain unclear from available records. Occasionally, journalists sought him out. In one interview from 1947, Morell insisted he had been a good doctor doing his best for a difficult patient. He claimed that history would eventually recognize his medical innovations, that the vitamin compounds and treatment protocols he developed were ahead of their time. No such recognition ever came. People who encountered Morell in those final years described a man consumed by bitterness and delusion. He would rant about the jealousy of other doctors, about how he had been scapegoated for Hitler's decisions. He claimed to be writing a comprehensive medical treatise that would vindicate his methods. No such manuscript has ever been found. His health continued to deteriorate. The heart problems that had plagued him in the bunker worsened. He suffered at least one additional heart attack in 1947. He developed jaundice, suggesting liver damage, possibly from years of self-medication with his own compounds. On May 26, 1948, 3 years after the war's end, and just days after his 62nd birthday, Theodor Morell suffered a massive stroke. He was admitted to a hospital in Tegernsee, where he lingered for a few hours before dying that same evening. His death was noted in a few German newspapers with brief factual obituaries. No major international outlets reported it. There was no funeral procession, no elaborate ceremony. He was buried in a small cemetery in Tegernsee, and his grave marker bore only his name and dates, with no mention of his profession or historical significance. That should be the end of the story. But here's what makes Morell's fate particularly poignant. He died believing he had been a great doctor, undone by political circumstance rather than personal failing. So what do historians make of Theodor Morell today? The assessment is not kind, but it's more nuanced than simple condemnation. Modern medical analysis of Morell's treatment records reveals a physician practicing what can only be described as polypharmacy run amok. The sheer number of medications, many with overlapping or contradictory effects, would be considered dangerous malpractice by contemporary standards. Dr. Leonard Hastened and Renata Hastened, who conducted one of the most thorough medical analyses of Hitler's health, concluded that Morell's treatments likely contributed to several of Hitler's symptoms, particularly the tremors, digestive problems, and psychological changes observed in his final years. The methamphetamine injections alone would have caused significant issues: disrupted sleep patterns, paranoia, irritability, and impaired judgment when dosages weren't maintained. The opioids would have created dependency and withdrawal symptoms. The combination of stimulants and sedatives would have created a pharmacological roller coaster affecting mood and cognition. But here's the critical question that historians continue to debate. Did Morell's treatment significantly affect the course of history? Some argue yes, that Hitler's increasingly erratic military decisions, his refusal to consider tactical retreats, and his paranoid purges of competent military officers were all influenced by years of drug-induced cognitive impairment. In this interpretation, Morell bears indirect responsibility for prolonging the war and causing additional suffering. Others argue this gives Morell too much credit and Hitler too little blame. Hitler's fundamental ideological commitments, his strategic vision however flawed, and his capacity for cruelty existed long before Morell's treatments began. The medications might have exacerbated certain symptoms, but they didn't create the core pathology. Professor Richard Evans, one of the leading historians of Nazi Germany, takes a middle position. He argues that while Morell's treatments likely didn't alter Hitler's basic ideology or grand strategy, they may have affected his day-to-day judgment, particularly in the war's later stages when dosages increased and Hitler's dependency deepened. What's not debatable is that Morell represents a peculiar type of historical figure. Someone who achieved enormous power through proximity rather than competence, who shaped events through negligence rather than intention, and whose greatest impact came from what he failed to do rather than what he accomplished. He failed to recognize his patient's dependency. He failed to consider the long-term effects of his treatments. He failed to allow other medical professionals to provide oversight. and he failed to understand that his primary duty was to heal rather than to maintain his position. Before we conclude, there's one more twist to this story that continues to intrigue researchers: the question of Morell's missing records. We know Morell kept meticulous documentation. The medical files captured in the bunker are detailed and comprehensive, but they only cover certain periods. There are gaps, missing months, and allusions in interrogation transcripts to additional records that were never recovered. In 1981, a German researcher named Werner Maser claimed he had located portions of Morell's personal diary from the war years. The diary allegedly contained observations about Hitler's mental state, discussions of other Nazi leaders' health problems, and Morell's own doubts about some of his treatments. Maser published excerpts but never released the full document for independent verification. After his death, attempts to locate the complete diary in his estate were unsuccessful. Either it never existed, or it remains in private hands, withheld from historical scrutiny. Similarly, there have been periodic claims that Morell's pharmaceutical formulas and experimental protocols survived in private archives. A 1990s lawsuit in Germany involved competing pharmaceutical companies claiming ownership of Morell's original compound recipes, suggesting someone had preserved these documents. Why would anyone keep such records secret? The most plausible explanation is financial. If Morell's vitamin compounds or other preparations contained proprietary blends, they could potentially have commercial value, however dubious. Alternatively, families of individuals mentioned in his diaries might prefer their ancestors' medical histories remain private. But there is also a darker possibility that the missing records contain information about Morell's work that goes beyond Hitler's treatment, perhaps experimental medications tested on concentration camp prisoners or other unethical research that would be considered war crimes. There's no concrete evidence for this, but Morell's pharmaceutical companies did receive contracts from the SS, and some historians have questioned where he sourced certain biological materials for his preparations. The complete truth about his activities remains obscured by missing documentation. So, what really happened to Hitler's private doctor? The factual answer is straightforward. He was captured, interrogated, released, and died in obscurity 3 years after the war ended, a broken man whose grandiose self-image never aligned with his actual legacy. But the deeper question, the one that makes this story worth examining, is what his life tells us about power, complicity, and the dangers of unchecked authority. Theodor Morell was not a monster in the conventional sense. He didn't orchestrate mass murder. He didn't design weapons or plan invasions. By most accounts, he genuinely believed he was helping his patient. Yet his impact was profound precisely because of his position and his incompetence. He had the power to potentially alter the mental state of a dictator, making decisions that affected millions of lives. He had access without accountability, and he used that position to enrich himself while telling himself he was saving his patient's life. His story is a reminder that history isn't only shaped by the obvious villains and heroes. Sometimes it's shaped by the mediocre physician who gets lucky, gains access, and never questions whether his miracle cures might actually be slow-acting poisons. We often ask how ordinary people enabled such an extraordinary regime of horror. Morell provides one answer. Through a combination of opportunism, self-delusion, and the human tendency to protect one's position even when evidence suggests we're causing harm. In the end, Theodor Morell was less important than he thought, but more significant than he deserved to be. He administered to a tyrant, potentially compromised that tyrant's judgment, enriched himself in the process, and died believing he'd been wronged by history rather than judged accurately by it. His grave in Tegernsee is rarely visited. There are no monuments, no museums dedicated to his work. His pharmaceutical companies are long gone. His medical theories have been thoroughly discredited. What remains is a cautionary tale about a doctor who forgot that his first duty was to heal. who became intoxicated by proximity to power and who paid the ultimate price. Not death or imprisonment, but irrelevance and the knowledge that history would remember him not as a great physician, but as a footnote to catastrophe. The mystery of what happened to Hitler's private doctor has a simple answer. The mystery of why we should care about him has a more complex one. Because in understanding how he achieved his position and what he did with it, we understand something essential about how systems of power can elevate the wrong people for the wrong reasons with devastating consequences. And that lesson remains relevant long after the last injection was administered, and the last prescription was written in that Berlin bunker 80 years ago. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more untold stories from history. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.